There's something rather peculiar about the way we've organized our lives around this impossible ideal. We've somehow convinced ourselves that perfection is not only attainable, but necessary. That every move we make must be flawless. Every word we speak must be precisely correct. Every decision we choose must be optimal. We walk through life like tightrope walkers, terrified of making a single misstep, not realizing that we're performing this death-defying act over perfectly safe ground. I want to suggest something that might sound revolutionary, though it's really quite obvious once you see it. What if the very thing you've been trying to avoid, this dreaded imperfection, is actually the most beautiful and necessary aspect of being human? What if your mistakes aren't evidence of your inadequacy, but proof of your aliveness? Let me tell you about Marcus, a brilliant architect who hadn't designed anything in 3 years, not because he'd lost his passion or his talent, but because he'd become so paralyzed by the possibility of creating something less than perfect that he'd stopped creating altogether. He would start projects with tremendous enthusiasm, sketching preliminary designs with joy and excitement, but the moment he began to refine them, the critical voice would begin its relentless commentary. This isn't innovative enough. That's been done before. This angle is slightly off. That proportion could be better. And slowly, sketch by sketch, the joy would drain away until he was left staring at blank paper, unable to make a single mark for fear it would be the wrong one. Marcus had fallen into what I call the perfection trap. He had become so focused on creating something flawless that he had forgotten the fundamental truth about creation. It is inherently messy, unpredictable, and beautifully imperfect. He was trying to compose symphonies in his head before allowing himself to play a single note. This is the terrible irony of perfectionism. In our attempt to create something perfect, we often create nothing at all. We become so afraid of imperfection that we choose sterility over vitality, paralysis over progress, death over life. Think about nature for a moment. Have you ever seen a perfect tree, a perfectly symmetrical flower, a flawlessly shaped mountain? Of course not. Nature is beautifully, magnificently imperfect. Every tree leans slightly in some direction, shaped by the winds it has weathered and the light it has sought. Every flower blooms with its own unique character, no two exactly alike. Every mountain bears the scars and stories of the forces that formed it. And yet, would we call any of these things flawed? Would we say that the leaning tree is somehow inadequate because it doesn't grow straight up? Would we criticize the asymmetrical flower for not conforming to some geometric ideal? The very idea seems absurd because we intuitively understand that their imperfections are what make them beautiful, what give them character and life. But when it comes to ourselves, we suddenly adopt a completely different standard. We imagine that we should be like perfect geometric forms, symmetrical and flawless. We forget that we too are part of nature and that our imperfections are not bugs in the system, but features that make us wonderfully, uniquely human. Marcus's breakthrough came during a conversation with an old professor who had taught him years earlier. The professor was nearing retirement and had invited Marcus to see his personal studio, a space Marcus had never visited before. As they walked in, Marcus expected to see perfectly organized shelves of pristine models and flawlessly executed drawings. Instead, he found chaos. Beautiful, creative chaos. There were half-finished sculptures covered in dust, sketches tacked to walls with crooked edges, models held together with tape and hope, projects abandoned midstream sat next to others that had been revisited dozens of times. Paint splatters and pencil shavings covered every surface. It looked like the workshop of someone who wasn't afraid to make messes, who wasn't paralyzed by the possibility of imperfection. This is where the real work happens, the professor said with a smile. Not in the clean presentations we show clients, but here in the mess, in the experimentation, in the willingness to fail spectacularly in pursuit of something alive. He picked up a small clay model that was clearly unfinished, with rough edges and asymmetrical proportions. This little fellow has taught me more about architecture than all the perfect drawings I ever made. See how it leans? That wasn't intentional. The clay was too wet when I made it. But that lean gives it character, makes it feel like it has a story. Sometimes our mistakes are more intelligent than our intentions. This was the moment Marcus began to understand the perfection of imperfection. His professor wasn't advocating for sloppiness or carelessness. He was pointing to something much deeper, the recognition that creation is a living process, not a mechanical one. And living processes are inherently imperfect, constantly growing, changing, adapting. When you try to control every aspect of the creative process, when you attempt to eliminate all possibility of error, you squeeze the life out of it. You turn creation into manufacturing, art into assembly line production. And what you get might be technically correct, but it lacks soul, lacks the spark that comes from spontaneity and surprise. The professor continued, I used to be like you, paralyzed by perfectionism. I would spend hours on single lines, trying to make them perfectly straight or perfectly curved. But then I realized something. The most beautiful calligraphy isn't perfectly uniform. The most moving music isn't rhythmically perfect. The most compelling architecture isn't geometrically flawless. There's something about slight imperfections that makes things feel human, feel alive. This is what perfectionists never understand. They think that flawlessness equals beauty, but actually, the opposite is true. Perfect symmetry is static. Perfect proportions are predictable. Perfect execution is sterile. It's the slight variations, the unexpected elements, the mistakes that give something character and vitality. Think about your favorite piece of music. I guarantee there are tiny imperfections in it. Maybe the singer's voice cracks slightly on a high note. Maybe the drummer rushes the beat just a little in the chorus. Maybe there's a slight buzz in the guitar amp. But these imperfections don't detract from the music. They are part of what makes it feel real, human, alive. Or consider your closest relationships. Are they perfect? Of course not. There are misunderstandings, awkward moments, times when you say the wrong thing or react poorly. But these imperfections don't ruin the relationships. They are what make them deep and real and meaningful. It's in the imperfect moments that we reveal our humanity to each other. Marcus began to experiment with this new understanding. He started what he called imperfection exercises. He would set a timer for 10 minutes and force himself to complete an entire design sketch before it went off. No erasing, no starting over, no perfectionist paralysis, just pure imperfect creation. The first few sketches were terrible by his previous standards. Lines wobbled where they should have been straight, proportions were off, perspectives were skewed, but something magical began to happen. In the imperfection, personality began to emerge. The wobbly lines had character. The skewed perspectives created unexpected spatial relationships. The wrong proportions suggested new possibilities he never would have considered. More importantly, he was creating again. After 3 years of paralysis, he was making dozens of sketches every day. Some were better than others, but all of them were alive in a way his previous work had never been. They had a quality of spontaneity and freshness that his perfectly planned designs had lacked. This is the great secret of creation. It requires a willingness to be bad before you can be good. Every master craftsperson, every acclaimed artist, every successful entrepreneur has a trail of imperfect work behind them. But they didn't let the imperfections stop them. They understood that perfection isn't the goal. Growth is, improvement is, discovery is. When you're willing to be imperfect, you can experiment. When you can experiment, you can learn. When you can learn, you can grow. When you can grow, you become more than you were before. But if you demand perfection from the start, you never start at all. I remember watching a master potter at work once. Her hands moved with incredible skill and confidence as she shaped the clay on the wheel. But then, just as the pot was nearly complete, she pressed too hard, and it collapsed into a shapeless mound. I expected her to be frustrated, perhaps angry at the waste of time and effort. Instead, she laughed. "Ah," she said, "the clay is reminding me not to get too attached." She gathered up the collapsed clay, wedged it briefly, and began again. No drama, no self-recrimination, no pause to worry about whether she might make the same mistake again. Just immediate, joyful return to the work. "The clay doesn't care about my ego," she explained. "It doesn't know that I'm supposed to be a master potter. It just responds to what I do with it in this moment. If I press too hard, it collapses. If I'm gentle, it rises. If I fight it, it becomes unworkable. If I collaborate with it, it becomes something beautiful. The clay is my teacher as much as I am its shaper." This is the wisdom of embracing imperfection. When you stop fighting against the natural messiness of creation, when you stop demanding that everything go according to your perfect plan, you can begin to collaborate with life rather than trying to control it. You can dance with circumstances rather than wrestling with them. But our culture has trained us to believe the opposite. We're taught that mistakes are bad, that errors are signs of incompetence, that anything less than perfect is failure. We grade students on their ability to avoid wrong answers rather than their willingness to explore interesting questions. We promote employees who never make mistakes rather than those who take creative risks. We admire people who appear flawless rather than those who are courageously vulnerable about their struggles. This perfectionist conditioning goes so deep that many people have forgotten how to learn. Learning, after all, is an inherently imperfect process. You start with ignorance, make mistakes, receive feedback, adjust, and gradually improve. But if you're terrified of being wrong, if you can't tolerate the discomfort of not knowing, if you need to appear competent at all times, you can't engage authentically with this process. I've watched brilliant people become mediocre because they were so afraid of being temporarily bad at something new that they only ever engaged with things they already knew how to do perfectly. They became prisoners of their own competence, trapped in narrow expertise because they couldn't bear the humility of being beginners again. This fear of imperfection doesn't just limit our creativity and learning. It cuts us off from the very source of joy and aliveness. Joy emerges from spontaneity, from surprise, from the unexpected. But spontaneity is inherently imperfect. Surprise can't be planned. The unexpected can't be controlled. When you insist on perfection, you eliminate the possibility of pleasant surprises. You script your life so carefully that there's no room for serendipity. You control your environment so completely that there's no space for wonder. You plan your conversations so thoroughly that there's no opportunity for genuine connection. Marcus discovered this when he began showing his imperfect sketches to clients. He was terrified at first. These weren't the polished presentations he used to create, with every line carefully considered and every angle precisely calculated. These were rough, immediate, spontaneous expressions of ideas. But something unexpected happened. Clients loved them. They could see the thinking process, the exploration, the aliveness in the marks. The sketches sparked conversations about possibilities rather than presentations of fixed solutions. Clients felt invited to participate in the creative process rather than simply approve a finished product. "I can see you thinking," one client said. "These drawings feel alive, like they're still growing. Your old presentations were beautiful, but they felt closed, finished. These feel like invitations to discover something together." This is what happens when you stop hiding your imperfections and start sharing them. People connect with your humanity rather than your facade. They can relate to your struggles because they recognize them as universal. They can appreciate your growth because they can see the process, not just the results. Think about the people you most admire, the ones you feel closest to. I bet they're not the ones who seem perfect. They're the ones who are honest about their imperfections, who can laugh at their mistakes, who are vulnerable about their struggles. Their imperfections don't make them less lovable. They make them more human, more relatable, more real. The Japanese have a beautiful concept called wabi-sabi, which finds beauty in imperfection and impermanence. In the tea ceremony, the most prized bowls are often those with slight irregularities, cracks that have been repaired with gold, or asymmetries that give them character. These aren't seen as flaws, but as evidence of a unique history, as sources of beauty that mass-produced perfection could never achieve. There's another Japanese practice called kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold or silver, making the cracks part of the object's beauty rather than something to hide. The philosophy behind this practice is that breakage and repair are part of the history of an object, not something to disguise. The repaired piece is often considered more beautiful than the original, because it carries the story of its breaking and healing. What if we applied this wisdom to ourselves? What if instead of trying to hide our cracks, our mistakes, our imperfections, we saw them as opportunities for beauty? What if our failures weren't shameful secrets, but interesting stories? What if our struggles weren't evidence of inadequacy, but proof of our willingness to engage fully with life? This doesn't mean celebrating mediocrity or being careless with our work. It means understanding that excellence and perfection are two very different things. Excellence is about bringing your full attention and care to whatever you're doing. Perfection is about meeting some impossible external standard. Excellence is sustainable and life-giving. Perfection is exhausting and soul-crushing. You can strive for excellence while embracing imperfection. In fact, this might be the only way to achieve real excellence. When you're not paralyzed by perfectionist fears, you can take risks, experiment, push boundaries. When you're not exhausted by the impossible pursuit of flawlessness, you have energy for genuine innovation. Marcus eventually became more successful than he had ever been during his perfectionist years, but success came to mean something different. Instead of trying to create perfect buildings, he focused on creating buildings that were perfectly suited to their purpose and context. Instead of pursuing flawless designs, he embraced designs that were beautifully alive. His buildings began to have a quality that his perfectly planned structures had never possessed. They felt organic, responsive to their environment. They had what architects call a hand, the sense that they were made by human beings for human beings. They were technically excellent, but not technically perfect, and that imperfection made them feel warm, welcoming, real. Years later, Marcus would tell his own students what his professor had taught him. Don't try to be perfect. Try to be present. Don't aim for flawlessness. Aim for aliveness. Don't seek to eliminate all mistakes. Seek to make interesting mistakes, mistakes you can learn from, mistakes that reveal new possibilities. This is the perfection of not being perfect. It's the recognition that our flaws are not obstacles to overcome, but features that make us who we are. It's the understanding that our mistakes are not failures, but experiments. It's the wisdom that our imperfections are not evidence of inadequacy, but proof of our humanity. When you embrace this wisdom, something wonderful happens. You stop wasting energy trying to be someone you're not, and start investing it in becoming more fully who you are. You stop hiding your authentic self and start sharing it generously. You stop living in the future where you imagine you'll someday be perfect and start engaging fully with the imperfect present where life is actually happening. You discover that perfection was never the goal anyway. The goal was always to be alive, to be real, to be courageously and beautifully human. And being human means being imperfect. It means making mistakes and learning from them. It means failing sometimes and getting up again. It means being wonderfully, perfectly imperfect. So perhaps today you might experiment with this freedom. Perhaps you might try something you're not sure you can do perfectly. Perhaps you might share something you've been keeping hidden because it isn't quite right yet. Perhaps you might discover that your imperfections aren't obstacles to overcome, but gifts to celebrate. Let me share another story that illustrates this beautifully. There was a renowned chef named Isabella who ran one of the most celebrated restaurants in the city, but she carried a secret that would have shocked her admirers. Some of her most famous dishes, the ones that food critics raved about and customers traveled hundreds of miles to taste, had been born from spectacular mistakes. Her signature risotto, for instance, came about when she accidentally added twice the amount of wine she intended. Her apprentice had distracted her mid-pour, and by the time she realized her error, the rice was already absorbing the excess liquid. Her first instinct was to throw it away and start over. But something about the way the kitchen smelled, something about the deeper color the rice was taking on, made her pause. Let's see what happens, she thought, and continued cooking. The result was unlike any risotto she had ever made. The extra wine had created layers of complexity she never could have planned. It became the foundation for her most requested dish, but she never could have invented it through careful planning. It required the beautiful accident of imperfection. Isabella told me that this experience changed her entire approach to cooking. She began to see mistakes not as disasters to be avoided, but as collaborators in the creative process. She started what she called accident journals, documenting the happy mistakes that led to new discoveries. Over time, she noticed that her most innovative dishes came not from following recipes perfectly, but from the moments when things went wrong. A recipe is just a starting point, she would tell her students. The real cooking happens in the space between intention and surprise. If you follow the recipe too rigidly, you miss the magic that wants to happen. You have to be precise enough to create good flavors, but loose enough to let unexpected flavors emerge. This wisdom applies far beyond the kitchen. In every creative endeavor, in every relationship, in every attempt to live a meaningful life, there's this delicate balance between intention and surrender, between planning and allowing, between control and flow. The perfectionist tries to eliminate the allowing, the surrender, the flow. They want only control, only planning, only rigid adherence to their predetermined vision. But this approach cuts them off from the most interesting possibilities. It's like trying to have a conversation where you've scripted not only everything you're going to say, but everything the other person is going to say as well. It might be technically correct, but it won't be a real conversation. Real conversations happen in the spaces between words, in the unexpected responses, in the moments when someone says something that surprises even themselves. I think about the great jazz musicians and how their most memorable performances are never note-perfect reproductions of written music. They're explorations, adventures into unknown musical territory. The musicians have deep technical skill, yes, but they use that skill as a foundation for improvisation, for responding spontaneously to what their fellow musicians are doing, for following the music wherever it wants to go in that particular moment. A perfectionist approach to jazz would be a contradiction in terms. You can't plan spontaneity. You can't perfect improvisation. You can only develop the skills and sensitivity that allow you to respond authentically to whatever emerges in the moment. The mistakes in jazz often become the most interesting moments, the places where new musical ideas are born. Sarah, a former student of mine, learnt this lesson in perhaps the most unexpected way. She had been struggling for years to write the perfect novel. She had outlines and character charts and plot diagrams covering every wall of her study. She had researched her subject exhaustively, crafted perfect sentences, and revised every paragraph until it gleamed with technical precision. And yet somehow her novel felt dead on the page. It was correct in every way but alive in none. The characters did exactly what they were supposed to do, but they never surprised her. The plot unfolded according to plan, but it never took her anywhere she hadn't already been. She was so focused on making it perfect that she had forgotten to let it be real. Then one day her computer crashed. 3 months of meticulous work vanished in an instant. She sat staring at the blank screen, feeling like the universe was playing a cruel joke on her. She had backups, of course, but they were weeks old. Hours of careful revision, polishing, perfecting, all gone. In that moment of despair, something unexpected happened. Instead of trying to recreate what she had lost, she started writing something completely different. Without her outlines and charts, without her careful plans, she just began telling a story. She wrote quickly, impulsively, following characters who seemed to have minds of their own, into situations she hadn't planned. The writing that emerged was rougher than her previous work, but it was alive in a way her perfect prose had never been. The characters made mistakes, said things that surprised even her, got into trouble she hadn't anticipated. The plot wandered down unexpected paths, discovered themes she hadn't intended to explore. It was messier, wilder, more imperfect than anything she had ever written. And it was also the best thing she had ever written. When she showed it to her writing group, the response was immediate and unanimous. "This is it," they said. "This is your voice. This feels real." The very imperfections that she had been trying so hard to eliminate were what made the work compelling. The rough edges gave it texture. The unexpected turns made it surprising. The unplanned moments made it feel authentic. This experience taught Sarah something profound about the creative process. She realized she had been approaching writing like an engineer building a bridge, everything calculated, measured, optimized for a predetermined outcome. But writing, she discovered, was more like gardening. You could prepare the soil, plant the seeds, provide water and sunlight, but you couldn't control exactly how the plants would grow. You had to work with what emerged, trim here, support there, but ultimately trust the organic process of growth and development. The paradox is this: the more willing you are to be imperfect, the more perfect your work becomes. Not perfect in the sense of flawless, but perfect in the sense of being exactly what it needs to be. When you stop trying to force your work into some predetermined mold and start allowing it to become what it naturally wants to become, it develops a quality of authenticity that no amount of technical perfection can achieve. This applies to how we live our lives as well. Many people approach their existence like Sarah approached her first novel. Carefully planned, meticulously controlled, optimized according to some external standard of what a successful life should look like. They have 5-year plans and life goals and vision boards. They measure their progress against carefully constructed metrics. They revise and edit their choices until they align with their predetermined vision of perfection. But life, like writing, is not an engineering project. It's more like an improvisation, a jazz performance where you're both the musician and the music. You need some structure, some skills, some sense of direction. But you also need to be open to the unexpected opportunities, the surprising connections, the beautiful accidents that can't be planned, but only received when they appear. When you insist on perfect control over your life's narrative, you often miss the most interesting plot developments. When you're so focused on executing your plan flawlessly, you become blind to better possibilities that weren't part of your original vision. When you can't tolerate deviation from your predetermined path, you cut yourself off from the adventures that are trying to find you. The most fulfilled people I know are not those who executed perfect life plans, but those who learned to dance skillfully with imperfection. They had goals and intentions, but they held them lightly. They made plans, but they remained open to better plans that emerged along the way. They worked toward their dreams, but they didn't let those dreams prevent them from seeing opportunities that were even more wonderful than what they had imagined. This is the art of what I call productive imperfection, being disciplined enough to create structure and loose enough to allow magic. It's like learning to surf. You need enough skill and preparation to get on the wave, but once you're riding it, you have to respond moment by moment to forces you can't control. The best surfers are not those who try to dominate the wave, but those who learn to collaborate with it, to find the perfect balance between intention and surrender. In the end, the pursuit of perfection is really about fear. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of not being enough. But when you embrace imperfection, you're really embracing courage. The courage to be seen as you are rather than as you think you should be. The courage to try things you might fail at. The courage to be beautifully, wonderfully, perfectly human. Because that's what perfection really is. It's not the absence of flaws, it's the presence of authenticity. It's not the elimination of mistakes. It's the wisdom to learn from them. It's not the achievement of some impossible ideal. It's the courage to be imperfectly, gloriously, completely yourself. So perhaps today you might experiment with this freedom. Perhaps you might try something you're not sure you can do perfect. Perhaps you might share something you've been keeping hidden because it isn't quite right yet. Perhaps you might discover that your imperfections aren't obstacles to overcome, but gifts to celebrate. Because in the end, perfection is not about being flawless. It's about being complete. And you are already complete, cracks and all. Your imperfections don't diminish you. They define you. They make you unique, interesting, beautifully human. The pursuit of perfection is the pursuit of an illusion, but the embrace of imperfection, that's the embrace of reality. And reality, with all its beautiful messiness, is the only place where real life can happen.